Good evening, all, and welcome. Tonight we're traveling to Japan to experience some scary stories from the middle of nowhere. I am being joined by my good friend Jay Nightmares for this adventure, so be sure to check him out when you're done. Links will be in the description and on screen. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Pack your flashlights and let the darkness take control. This happened a few years ago, and I'll never forget what I saw that night. I was at home doing nothing in particular when a friend called and asked if I wanted to go out. Bear in mind it was around 3 a.m. at this time. He said he would come and get me in his car. We were driving around the city for a while when my friend suddenly said, "Hey, let's go to the wharf." So that's where we headed. Down by the pier area by the wharf, there's an old factory. In the daytime, trucks are in and out of there, and it's a pretty busy area, but at night it was quiet. The roads by the wharf are really wide and straight, and on weekend nights you can sometimes see people racing there, but that night we were the only ones on the road. It made for quite a tense atmosphere. We headed to the wharf like we were being drawn there, and we stopped at a traffic light, and a car pulled up alongside us. I cannot remember the model or colour of the car. I guess it was more like a minivan than a car, come to think of it, but it was larger than a regular car. I'm in the passenger seat and my friend is driving. The lights change and I look at the car and the people in it, when I got a really weird vibe. I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I noticed one of the guys in the back seat. It dawned on me, the reason I felt off was that I couldn't see the bottom half of its face, like it was missing or completely black. Was I hallucinating? Was I overtired? I kept looking at the guy, was curious, and I locked eyes with him and the car sped away before the lights changed. They ran the red. In the split second, I saw the guy, his eyes flashed my way, and I have never seen such a look of desperation before nor since. His eyes seemed to scream at me. He pressed his face against the window, and it was like he was pulled backwards before the car sped off. When he was close against the window, I realized the black thing I saw was tape, and all of this happened within a matter of seconds. But the look of fear in his eyes stayed with me. I was deeply concerned as the minivan sped away into the night towards the wharf. I heard rumors that the Yakuza used to hang out there and were responsible for some of the missing person cases in the area and some of the bodies that washed up in the wharf over the years. People say the wharf is haunted because of this. It's always been known as a kind of test of courage to head there on weekend nights, but I've never spoken to anyone who went down there on weekday nights. We don't know what goes on down there when the town sleeps, but I think that night I got a pretty good idea.
A long time ago, I read a story similar to my own experience on the internet. It's so frustrating that I cannot find it these days, as I would love to ask the OPs some questions. It was this story about a bunch of mannequins out in the middle of nowhere. They were arranged to look like a family, and it was such a creepy story. Hi guys, let me cut in and just say that I found the story this person couldn't. It's one I've actually done before, but it's a good one. It will be the next story after this one. So now back to the story. My family lives in the countryside, and the mountains are all around us. It's pretty nice. Sometimes we would go into the woods and pick wild vegetables. My grandpa taught me how to forage and where to find vegetables and mushrooms when I was in elementary school. By the time I was in junior high school, I went alone or with friends on trips into the forest. It was a Sunday, and me and 2 friends had arranged to go into the woods for foraging. I don't know why we all loved to do it. Maybe it was because it made us feel mature or something. I don't know. Things went well to begin with, but when we grew tired and decided to head home, things went downhill. We were walking down the narrow dirt path we had used to enter the forest, and my friend screamed. Well, it wasn't uncommon to cut your legs on a branch or have a bug fly at you or land on you. That's what I thought happened at first. I looked over to him, and he wasn't rubbing a wound or swatting away a bug. He was stood completely still and he was staring upwards. My other friend was staring in the same direction too. I looked at what they were looking at. there were 2 bodies hanging from a tree branch. They were hung by their necks, and their body was stock still. I had never seen anything that frightening. It was positively traumatizing. It looked to be a man and a woman. I was so shocked that I couldn't speak. I instinctively began to back away as panic began to settle in. I couldn't look away though. Once I had taken a couple of steps back, I realized that they weren't just the bodies of humans. They were the bodies of mannequins. It must have been a prank. What a cruel prank to pull, I thought. We were all so annoyed at the prank. We were complaining about it as we walked back down the mountain path. I explained what happened to my dad when I got home, and he said he would go up there. I wanted to go with him and help him. We took a stepladder, some pruning scissors, and a hatchet. My friend said that they would come too. When we got there, he set up the stepladder, and we helped keep it steady as he climbed it. He then cut the rope from around the male mannequin's neck, and it fell to the ground. We were going to take it back to the barn and get rid of it. If we left it out there, then maybe it could be used again in another prank, and my dad didn't want us boys to be spooked out by it. It had clearly affected my friends and I. My dad said that he wanted to smash the thing up and throw it away in bin bags. He took the clothes off the thing to separate them, and that was when we noticed that there was something written on the mannequin's chest and stomach. "Whoever takes this mannequin down will die," was written in bright red letters. We all stood there, as still as those mannequins were hanging from the tree. It was really creepy. My dad clearly wanted to get rid of these mannequins as fast as he could, so he got straight back onto the stepladder without saying a word. He cut the female mannequin's noose, and it dropped to the ground with a dull thud. It was wearing a flowery one-piece dress. We could already see the red writing peeking over the top of her dress. "Whoever takes this mannequin down, the person you love the most in life, will die." My dad stood there, silent again. We didn't know what to do, but then my dad spoke and his words cut through the strange atmosphere those hanging mannequins had created. "Here, boys, go get yourself a drink from the store." And with that, he handed us some money. He didn't usually do things like this. He was a bit tight with his cash. That's how I knew he was worried. He took the mannequins to the barn and smashed them up with an axe and disposed of them. My dad and my friends don't really like to talk about what happened that day. It's become a taboo subject. The most painful memory from that day is the constant reminder of what was written on the female mannequin's stomach. "The person you love the most in life will die." I've been worried about my mum, myself, Who could it be? I'm also worried about my dad. If such a curse exists, it may have been just a prank, but it was pretty traumatizing.
This happened a few years ago. Every summer, a few of my old school best friends and I get together and go on a little trip together. The year this occurred, we had decided to rent a cottage in the woods. It was going to be great. We were going to have a barbecue, a campfire, the works. It was the usual crew, me and 2 other friends. We're all female, by the way. My friend drove and it took us hours to get there, and it was already evening by the time we arrived at the cottage and we were all hungry. We had prepared for this, though. We brought all our barbecue gear and were ready to feast. We had a great night, chatting and reminiscing by the log fire and of course eating way too much. Even though it was summer, the sun had already set by 8 degrees, so that was our call to head back to the cottage. It was a real shame though. I suddenly had the urge to go to a hot spring. I know it sounds a little odd, but it's called an onsen in Japan and we love going to them in the summer. I mentioned it to the others and everyone was on the same page. We got fired up since we were all tired and full. The cottage didn't have a hot spring, so we hit a dead end. Not wanting to slow down or waste the trip, I got my phone out and started Googling to see if there were any nearby, and we were in luck. There was one just a short drive away. We quickly packed some clothes and jumped back into the car. Since we weren't familiar with the area, we were completely dependent on the car navigational system. The narrow roads were so dark since the forest was all around us. I didn't want to get lost out there, and I was starting to lose faith in my idea. But then we turned onto a highway road. The mood lifted in the car, and we were back to chatting and laughing. Then the satnav interrupted us. It was just one word. I noticed, because usually the satnav system said, "After 100 meters, turn right." This time it just said, "right." Another odd thing was that it asked us to turn while we were at a curve in the road. We turned back a little, and at the exact same point in the road, the satnav just said, "right." These country roads were very narrow. We didn't see the dirt road the first time, but spotted it when we double-backed. We obeyed the satnav and went down it. The laughter and sense of excitement in the car ebbed away and was replaced with a sense of anxiety. This road didn't seem like it was leading us to the hot springs. The forest road just got deeper and steeper and darker. It felt as though we were moving further from the town and the people, and I started to doubt the existence of the so-called hot springs. We ceased talking at this point. The air in the car was thick with tension, and I wanted to turn back, but knew that we couldn't. The road was only just wide enough for our car. There was no way we could U-turn, so I began to worry. I wondered what may happen if an oncoming car came at us at full speed. Since we didn't know where we were, we decided that we would stop and check out our surroundings, and I was amazed to discover we were near a cliff edge. I had no idea we had even driven up this high into the mountains. We ceased to talk at this point. The air in the car was thick with tension. I wanted to turn back, but I knew that we couldn't. The road was only just wide enough for our car. There was no way we could U-turn, so I began to worry. I wondered what may happen if an oncoming car came at full speed. Since we didn't know where we were, we decided that we would stop and check our surroundings out. I was amazed to discover that we were near a cliff edge. I had no idea we had driven this high up into the mountains, and I was lost for words, and so were my friends. Fear now had a hold on us. Forget the hot springs, we just needed to get back somewhere familiar. No one said a word, and I'm glad they didn't because I was panicking. We stared at one another's faces in the dark and wondered what to do. We had no choice but to keep going forward because the road simply wasn't wide enough to turn back, and I knew deep down that we were just getting further away from civilization. Just as our anxiety reached its peak, my friend spotted a point in the road where ahead it widened. Relieved, we sped towards it to perform the U-turn that would get us out of the mountainous woods. Then the car headlights illuminated a building. A building almost crumbled to ruins, a derelict and frightening-looking place. And at that moment, the satnav said, "You have arrived at your destination." At that very moment, the power in the car went out. We panicked, but it came back on instantly. We turned around and away back to the safety of the cottage. There was no hot spring. There was no way the creepy building in the woods could have been a hot spring either. And I cannot forget the event that we often speak about. Perhaps we were summoned or called by something in that abandoned building.
When I was young, it took about half an hour by bike to get to school. There was a bus, but the bus cost money. I didn't want to ask my parents for bus money all the time. Money was kind of a taboo subject back then in our family, so I was happy to go to school by bicycle. The route to school was simple enough. There was a river flowing halfway through the route from east to west. There were two routes you could choose. The first route goes alongside the river on the north side, but there is a national highway, so there's a lot of traffic, even at night. It's a little dangerous. The other route was the opposite side of the highway. This way was a lot more peaceful. There were only a few houses out there. You also had nicer scenic views. You could see the mountains, countryside fields, and of course, the dense forest. If you take this route at night, it's really unlikely that you'll pass by a car, a bike, or a person walking the streets. There were rumors about this route though. Some people said that ghosts appeared on that route. There were literally no streetlights, and because of this, most of the students at my school avoided that route on the way home. Not me though. I had ridden through the forest on that side with my dad since I was a kid. I knew the way so well that even when I came home late, I would turn the lights off on my bike and rely solely on the moonlight to guide me. It was relaxing. I would listen to the sound of the river. There was a really cool part of the woods where the branches of the trees had created this kind of natural arch. It looked like it was right out of a storybook. I loved it. On the night that this experience takes place, I was heading home late from school. I took part in some club activities, so it wasn't uncommon for me to be late home. It was already past 9 p.m, and I had stayed late to speak to friends. Someone said that a typhoon was coming, and we were all hoping that school would be closed tomorrow. So we didn't mind staying a little late if we weren't going to hang out tomorrow. The warm breeze was strong, so I decided to head home before the weather turned. So I chose my usual route home. Through the forest, just in case it rained. The clouds were low and looking grey. My bike had a kinetic energy-powered light bulb, so if I hit a switch, it would make pedaling a little harder, but it would provide light. I hit the switch, but the light didn't come on. I guessed that the bulb had bust. This was just what I needed. I tried to kick on and hurry home before it rained. It was so dark out, but my eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness. I was able to keep going with confidence along the roads, but I had to slow as I entered the forest. As I entered the forest, I felt that something was different. I felt a little frightened of the woods that night. I told myself that I didn't need to be scared. The forest is creepy at night, but it's the hole in the ear that lets in the fear, that and the absence of light. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind and entered the woods. The headwinds grew strong. As I passed through the woods, it made pedaling harder and harder. I grinned and bared it. I just wanted to go home. All of a sudden, there was a weird smell which accompanied the wind. It smelled so bad. Then I thought I could see something popping up and down, out of the dark just ahead. I stared forward, puzzled, and then that was when I felt something grab my left shoulder. I have never been scared of the forest, but that night changed everything. I pedaled as fast as I could, making a voiceless scream against the wind. My heart was racing. I was terrified. I put some distance between myself and where I felt the hand on my shoulder, and I thought to myself, whoa, finally I had a paranormal experience. I hope that's the end of it. I kept riding. I was powered by adrenaline. I swear I heard something behind me. I didn't have the courage to look behind me though. There was even less visibility than before. I hated it. Thankfully, the path had widened, and it was largely flat. For some reason, I shouted the name of my dog, and then I pedaled noticeably faster. I got through the forest, and I began to see the welcome sight of neighboring houses through the branches in the trees. I still didn't have the courage to look back and check if anything was following me. When I came out of the woods, there was a convenience store just the other side of the bridge. I chose that to be the point where I would look behind me. There was nothing chasing me. I felt my heart rate slow. I locked up my bike outside of the convenience store and I headed in. I have never been so happy to hear the sound of the entry bell in my life. I got even happier when I saw that a couple of my friends were stood by the magazine rack. They laughed and said that I looked like I had just seen a ghost. I chuckled with them, but I was too embarrassed to tell them what had happened. One of them looked at my shoulder with a grimace and then asked, "Mate, what happened to your shoulder? It's filthy." The fear came rushing back to me. I looked at my shoulder and there was some disgusting stain there. Immediately I unbuttoned my shirt and I hurled it into the trash. My friends all laughed and asked what the hell I was doing. I just got on my bike and left. When I got home, my mum asked me about what happened and why I wasn't wearing a goddamn shirt. I just said that I forgot it at school. Relax, I had an undershirt on. Dinner was ready for me, and I was hungry. I chowed down, and with chowing down comes clarity and rationality, because I arrived at the conclusion that perhaps something from above in the trees had fallen, blown by the wind, to land on my shoulder. Perhaps it wasn't a paranormal experience. With that in mind, I felt kind of embarrassed about how I acted back at the convenience store. I was a little scared, so I got my big sister and the dog to stay in my room that night. Unfortunately, school wasn't closed the next day. The typhoon didn't hit our area, so I had to go to school. However, thanks to my canine best friend, I was able to sleep, and sleep well. When I woke up, I had started to think that I had created a scene out of nothing. The embarrassment hadn't faded. I had breakfast with my family, grabbed an umbrella, and headed to school. I chose the other route to school that morning. I took a look at the forest when I got to the bridge, and it didn't look that daunting, but still I didn't want to go in there. On that day during lunch, I heard a story. I heard something that would justify my fears out there in the dark woods. I wasn't the only one who had an encounter out in the forest. There was a boy at school who was delivering newspapers. He was a couple of years older than me and my friend group, but my sister knew him. Anyway, his job was to deliver newspapers in our area and a small village just beyond the edge of the forest. So like me, he used the forest to get to and from his newspaper route. He would make these deliveries early, like really early. He was out on his bike delivering at 5:30 a.m., up at the crack of dawn. He headed through the woods as usual and stopped still in his tracks when he saw a body swinging in the morning breeze. The body's neck hung crooked from a tree limb. This is where mine and his stories crossed paths because I don't think I was grabbed on the shoulder that night. No. I think it was the clatter of some dangling foot that brushed my shoulder. I do not know if the individual who chose to take their life could have been saved at that point, but there is one thing I do know. Had the light on my bicycle worked, I might have been able to do something to save them, if it wasn't too late. I think about that night more than I'd like to admit. Yeah. If the light was working, maybe things would have been different. I never go through the forest these days.
This happened when I went to my friend's house. I rode my motorbike there, and it was my first time to visit him in his new place. He now lived in the countryside, and it was pretty far away, which meant that people and landmarks were few and far between. But I was able to find his house without getting lost. The roads were pretty much straight. It was a nice drive, to be honest. Getting home would be easy. That's what I thought anyway. Visibility would be pretty bad due to the forest on either side of the road. There were rows and rows of tall trees, and I made a mental note to head back before it got too dark. Things didn't go as planned. I ended up staying until around 10 p.m. We were having a really great night because some other friends joined us. When I hit the road shortly after 10, I went back the same way I came. The street lights were sparse and everything was so dark, it made it difficult to see. It's really creepy and unnerving to ride solo through roads like this at night. I was anxious something from the forest would leap into the road, but I had to keep going. I was heading home. Not to brag, but I am the kind of guy who usually doesn't get lost. I always thought that if I traveled along a road once, I would have no trouble remembering the way. I thought I was on the right road home, but somehow I managed to stray off down a road which turned into a dirt road in the forest. There was way more forks in the road than before. How did I end up on this road? I was going the same way I came. If you've never been in this scenario before, I can tell you it feels like a glitch in the Matrix or that time's gone missing. It makes you sweat and pretty confused. Well, it did that for me anyway. I don't know when I made the wrong turn, but now I was deep into the forest where the weeds and trees grew high. So tall, in fact, the moonlight was almost blotted out. I turned back around, because perhaps then I'd see something familiar. The only issue was I was riding by bike headlights alone at this point, and things seemed far less familiar than before. I didn't want to admit I was lost at this point. The road wasn't flat, and concentrating on keeping my bike stable was a welcome distraction. It had been about half hour or so since I first got on this dirt road, when I saw a parked car ahead. It looked like there were two people sat there. Perfect, I could ask for directions. I stopped my bike, a little bit behind the car, pulled out my cell phone and used the light to find my way to the car. Before anyone asks, this took place before smartphones. Besides playing Snake, the phone was a brick that would make phone calls, and on the off chance there was signal. When I got close enough, I called out, "Excuse me," but there was no response. They didn't even turn in the direction of my voice, and after calling out several times, and content that my voice was loud enough for them to hear me, I approached the window with my cell phone in hand. When I looked through the window, I noticed something, and my stomach churned. They had disturbingly pale skin. I ran back to the bike, skinning as I went, jumped out and fumbled for the ignition. In my head, I kept repeating, go home now, make it home. I felt like this prayer or chant seemed louder in my head and ears than the splutter of my bike's engine. Not long after I set off once more, I saw the figure of a person walking up ahead. Taking into account what had just happened, I was still shaken, sweating and frightened. I didn't want to stop. I kept going home. I just needed to leave the forest roads. Just as I was passing and about to overtake the person walking alone, I couldn't stop sweating and panicking. Then I heard the man laugh. He cackled such an insane, creepy laugh. I couldn't handle that. I accelerated and I knew I couldn't turn back, even though I was on a motorbike. I thought the weird guy was going to chase me or something. I kept my eyes on the road and told myself to calm down, and eventually I saw the dull glimmer of a streetlight ahead. One light eventually turned into two, and before I knew it, I was back on the main road. I pulled over, sat on the ground next to my bike, relieved that I made it out of there alive. I don't know where the hell I went for that hour, but I'm glad I made it back. Thinking back on that night always gives me shivers.
I know a ghost story. I don't remember everything perfectly, but I'll try my best. It's about this writer. I can't remember his name. This is a kind of urban legend. This is the kind of story you might hear sat around the campfire on a summer night. Anyway, this writer grew sick of the city, and he wanted to move somewhere else. He wanted to live life deep in the mountains, so he had a small wooden lodge built, and he moved out into the middle of nowhere. There was no electricity, gas, plumbing, or even a phone. There was just a fireplace. So, since the only heat source was a fireplace, the writer spoke with some people in the village at the foot of the mountain and found a married couple who sold charcoal on the side. He spoke with them and worked out a deal where he would get a delivery of charcoal once a week. He was living a good life out there in the mountains. He would plow fields, and when he felt like it, he would write. One peaceful night, he was awoken from his sleep by a strange noise. It was a kind of scratching sound. What the hell was that? With bleary eyes, he went in search of the sound. From here on, I will switch to the first person. There was light. There was a fire still burning in the fireplace, and I could see, albeit it was dark. The lodge wasn't exactly big, so it was easy to see your surroundings. Something stood out. There was something in front of one of the walls. It was just a simple wall made out of logs, and in front of that wall was the silhouette of a person. It was doing something. I couldn't quite make it out though. It looked like a very thin and slim silhouette. It was barely visible in the darkness. It was definitely human-like and definitely there. I could see from the back. I could only see from the back, but judging from its movements and the direction it was facing, I guessed that it was scratching the wall. It made sense because I could hear that scratching sound. I watched, and its movement continued. I don't know why, but I didn't care all that much. I just kind of fell asleep. Perhaps that was because I was really tired. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a laid-back guy. When I woke up in the morning, I went about my usual morning routine, and I almost didn't notice what was on the wall. Some messy scribbled letters were scrawled on the wall. It was hard to make out what they were, but on closer inspection, I realized that they said, "Kill" and "Help." The color of these letters was pitch black, and I presumed that they were made with charcoal. I looked at the floor, and there was powdered charcoal down there. I was really interested in this, and I wondered if the same phenomenon would happen again at night. When night fell, I made sure that my gas lanterns were lit in all four corners of the lodge, and there was plenty of logs on the fire. If that shadow appeared again, I was ready to take a closer look. I pretended to be asleep in bed, and I waited. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually I heard that scratching sound. I tried to leap out of bed, but I found that I couldn't move a muscle. Was this some kind of sleep paralysis? I guessed so, because all I could do was move my eyes. So I looked towards the direction of the scratching sound. Unlike last night, the lodge was much brighter. However, the shadowy figure still looked like a complete dark silhouette. I had moved my bed that night, and this time I was looking at the shadow side on. It was definitely humanoid. It was writing on the wall. I looked at the thing's hand, and I couldn't see any charcoal in its grasp. It was using its finger to write. The moment I realized this, it stopped. It was like I had paused a scene in a movie. It didn't move a muscle. Then, its head slowly turned to face me. It was agonizing. I couldn't take it. I felt as if I was losing my mind. I couldn't turn away, and I couldn't close my eyes. I was about to see its face. It didn't have a face. It was like there was a black hole there. It was entirely featureless. The stench of spoiled and burnt meat attacked my nose, and that was when I realized what it was. It wasn't a shadow. It was a burnt person. I must have passed out, and when I came to in the morning, there were more letters etched into the wooden walls which surrounded me. There was only one word this time, and that word was help. That was all I could stand in that lodge. I got dressed and I ran for the village at the bottom of the mountain. I needed to be around people. It felt like it took the longest time to get back to civilization. I went into the only bar they had there, and I ordered a drink. The barmaster asked me about the lodge, and if everything was okay, and I told him my tale, and I fully expected him to laugh at me, but he didn't. It was here that I heard an unexpected and terrifying story. The couple I had bought the charcoal from had been arrested. They had a daughter, and unbeknownst to the town, they had been punishing her physically. One day, it went too far, and the young high school student sadly passed away. Her parents burned her in an attempt to hide the evidence. They threw her body into a kiln. The daughter's high school teacher was concerned by her absence at school and had her own suspicions about her parents. The police got involved and discovered human remains in the kiln, and her parents were arrested. They confessed under police interrogation. I nearly threw up when something dawned on me. The charcoal that the couple had been delivering. It couldn't be, could it? The daughter's remains? I returned to the lodge after a few more drinks and collected all the remaining pieces of what I was told was charcoal and took them to a local temple to mourn for that girl's spirit.
I have been mountain climbing for many years and met some strange and interesting people along the way. I generally like climbing during the summer and do it during my annual leave. I love staying in mountain lodges and cabins and tend to occupy them for about a week. This year, I decided to stay in a lodge for a few nights before climbing. The lodge was really nice, one of the nicest ones I've ever stayed in. It was actually used as part of a forestry classroom for young climbers. It was pretty large. That being said, the facilities were outdated, but not too badly. I planned to leave early in the morning and return to the cabin, if all being well, by about lunchtime. Fortunately for me, the weather was on my side, and I ran into a group of about 10 climbers on the way. The group was led by 2 adults and 8 children. Since it was summer vacation time, it wasn't uncommon to see parties like this. There was something odd about this bunch though. They hardly seemed dressed for a hike or climb. They looked as if they were heading out for an afternoon stroll in the suburbs. I mean, I was used to seeing high school trips at the base, but never on the advanced routes. No disrespect to them, but the climbing route I was on was definitely for adults. The group didn't seem all that energetic either. I didn't expect them to be bouncing all over the place and super excited to be there, but I also didn't expect them to look so downtrodden and with such low energy. I saw this group as I was heading back to the lodge, and after seeing them I wanted nothing more than to be back in the lodge away from them. As I returned, I felt as if the lodge reminded me of how old it was. Those log cabin walls must have seen and heard a few stories. I could tell that this one wasn't a popular rental either. It seemed as if it hadn't been inhabited for a while. It was clean, but don't get me wrong, you could just tell no one had been in there for a long time. There was a notable layer of dust that seemed to state welcome. Other than dust, the debris of dead bugs and fallen leaves had made their way in there. It could have been unused for months and I wouldn't have known. While it beat sleeping out in the elements, I went to take a look at the facilities. All the cooking equipment looked fine, and decided to make an easy dinner and enjoy it by a roaring campsite fire. There is something relaxing about just watching a fire burn, wouldn't you agree? Well, the sun had already begun to set. It was a starry sky in full view. I was really enjoying myself, and the next morning I had plans to take in a little fishing. And I wanted to get there early, so I decided to grab an early night, and I was in my sleeping bag by 8 p.m. I positioned myself on the second floor of the lodge by a big window so that I could watch the night sky, and I drifted off to sleep for a while when I heard a noise. It sounded like a door being opened. It definitely sounded like there was someone else entering the lodge. I looked at my alarm clock. It was after 10 p.m. Who the hell comes in this late? I strained my ears to listen and try and place the direction the noise was coming from. It sounded like someone was walking around. I wondered if someone had simply mistaken my lodge for theirs. The more I heard footsteps pacing around down there, the more I realized there probably wasn't a mistake. Someone had intentionally entered the lodge. I didn't hear any words or conversation, just the sound of footsteps and the occasional sound of doors opening and closing. It was really weird and obviously frightening. I stayed and listened. The footsteps sounded like they had a squelchy quality to them, like they were wet or muddy. And I listened closely, but felt a bolt of ice pierce my heart when I realized that the footsteps sounded like they were climbing the stairs. I also came to the realization that they weren't just one pair of footsteps, but several. I broke into a cold sweat. I knew there shouldn't be anyone else in the area. It simply wasn't possible, but I could hear those incessant squelching footsteps. I tried to pull myself together and thought that if there was someone in there in need, a lost climber or a group perhaps, then I should call out to them and offer them the use of the cabin. That would be the only logical reason why someone would be here. The footsteps then reached the second floor. What are you looking for? Someone asleep? I couldn't hear any voices, but people were hovering around the cabin in silence. It was eerie, to say the least. The footsteps drew closer still. They sounded like they were right outside the room I was in. Fight or flight kicked in. I told myself, with what I thought in mind, to call out to the intruders and let them know of my presence. "Hey, I reserved this hut, just letting you know." The footsteps stopped at once. The cabin was silent. Then, for a few moments, the footsteps started again. They seemed to be coming from just outside the door. What the hell were they planning? I felt as if there was some kind of sinister plot in their silence. "What are you doing?" I said in a more aggressive tone. But I got no response and heard no movement. I didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings, but that night, I felt something mysterious. The weird standoff went on for about 10 minutes. I was out of my sleeping bag and on my feet, ready for anything. I had a weapon. There was still no movement out there, so I approached the door and listened, and I heard something. It sounded like very faint whispering. I couldn't really make out what they were saying. A few moments later, I heard that strange squelching sound again. It sounded like whatever was out there was leaving the door. I heard the wet footsteps descend the stairs and they left the lodge. The door opened and closed, and I raced to the window to look out. It looked like the shadowy silhouette of a small person, perhaps a child, walking away from the lodge. It was so dark that I couldn't say it with absolute certainty, but I think that's what it was. There was more than one of these silhouettes heading away from the lodge and down the mountain path. They seemed to disappear into the night sky. I ended up staying up all night. I wasn't going to close my eyes until I saw the morning light, and I thought that these shadowy figures would be back if I fell asleep. I abandoned my plans to stay in the lodge for the rest of the week and descended the mountains in the morning without issue. And let's just say I'm very more careful about the lodges I pick to stay in these days.
This happened when I was in university, when I was driving home from a trip. The roads were really dark as I was in the countryside. The mountains and trees were blotting out the moonlight. All of a sudden, my engine began to splutter and slow until it eventually came to a stop. I'm not the best with cars, so rather than waste any time with guesswork, I figured I'd call roadside rescue. I had that as part of my insurance. There was nothing much I could do except wait for someone to arrive. It was creepy out there. The forests are home to strange noises at night. After a little while, a bright light lit up the road and it was aimed at my car. I thought that roadside rescue were early. I couldn't believe my luck. But when the light got closer, I realized that it wasn't them. It was strange. It didn't look like the light of normal headlights. It stopped about 50 meters in front of my car and didn't move. It was getting a bit weird now. Unlike standard headlights, which are divided into two light sources, whatever was in front of me had only the one source of light. That light was so bright it didn't seem safe at all. It seemed not to have the same purpose as a light bulb. I didn't like it. And then I saw them. 3 people approaching from behind the light. These were very thin and very tall, pushing 2 meters, I'd say, 6'6". As they moved from behind the light to in front of it, I could see the lines in their face. Their faces were really gaunt and long. There was something off-putting about these 3 people that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first, but then I realized what it was. Their style of clothes and hair, etc. They looked like they were from another time period. It was like they had been wearing the same clothes since the 70s. They were wearing chinos, polo shirts, stuff like that. They approached my car and one of them spoke to me. Once again I noticed there was something slightly off-putting about these people. When they spoke, it had all the wrong intonations. Like he was emphasizing the wrong syllables. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but it just wasn't right. It made listening to them difficult. Yet I detected no accent to indicate that they were foreign. "Where did you come from?" he asked. I chose to remain silent before answering that. I didn't want to let these strangers know about my car's engine trouble, because essentially, I couldn't get away from them. "You have a trouble with your car and I can fix it," he said. It scared me that he knew that. I said thanks but no thanks. I had already called roadside rescue. The man was persistent. They kept refusing. I really didn't want to speak to these guys out here in the woods alone. Then the strangest thing happened. My thoughts felt like they were changing. Like I had to mentally wrestle with myself not to allow them to work on my car. It felt like my mind was being changed for me. I started to wonder if maybe they could help. Maybe it would be a good idea to unlock the door and let them in. I got out of my car, half of my mind screaming at the other half, imploring me to get back into my car and get the doors locked again. I couldn't fight it. I started following them towards the light. I was completely transfixed. I didn't need to think for myself. I tried to raise my arm, but I couldn't because I wasn't in control of it. I wanted to be scared, but this calm voice inside my head reassured me that there was nothing to fear. That part of me was still screaming to do anything I could to get away from these men, but That internal voice of mine was getting quieter and quieter. While I was walking towards that bright light, my phone started to ring. It must be the roadside rescue people. It snapped me back to reality. I was in control again. I was able to answer the phone. I was back. I knew that phone needed to be on. Something about that call saved me. I must have explained my location in about 10 different ways to the rescue people. I really wanted to be accurate. I didn't want to be out here anymore. Whilst I was on the phone, the men were trying to get me to take up their offer of help. I hated the way they towered over me. In their faces, they were so pale and thin, like barn owls. I refused. I had to. I ran back to my car with my phone clamped to the side of my head. And that was when they began to get angry. They were screaming and shouting by the side of my door. I began to doubt myself. Usually I would never refuse a kind favor, as I would be willing to do the same for someone in my situation, but given what just happened, I knew I couldn't trust these men. They were trying to express anger, but it was like the concept was entirely new to them. Eventually they gave up and headed back towards the beam of light. Before leaving, they did this weird thing simultaneously in front of my car. They placed an open palm on their foreheads and then slapped it. It's like as if you're doing a high five to your own head. Their fingers were long and spider-like. I don't have a clue what that gesture is supposed to mean. The light then shot backwards at tremendous speed and it was gone. Shortly after, the roadside rescue team showed up. The guy went to check the engine and couldn't find a single fault with it. He put my keys back in the ignition, turned it, and my engine started without issue. That really freaks me out because I know that my engine stopped. I hated it, but I needed to get out of the woods. I headed in the direction the light shot off in and managed to get home without any further incident. However, when I woke up the next day, I had a really strange rash all over my body. I went to see a dermatologist and he couldn't figure out the cause of the rash. I think the rash went away after 10 days or so with the cream and ointment I got from the dermatologist. I'm sure that rash was related to the bright light and those 3 men. Well, I say men, I'm not entirely convinced of that fact. About 2 years after this happened, I was at a party and a woman said that when she was driving out in the mountains in the same area that I was with her boyfriend, they said they saw something similar to what I did. She said on 2 occasions she saw beams of light flying across the night sky. Some people snickered at that, but I didn't. It felt all too real. Did we have some sort of encounter with a UFO? It must be really hard to believe this, but I wish I could just give you my memories or my mind for a while. The fear those 3 tall men instilled in me was otherworldly. That said, I don't know why my mind changed to trusting them like a light switch being switched on and off. It lingers in my thoughts often. It was truly disturbing.
I have a dog that's mixed bred called Kuro. My son, who's in high school, used to always walk the dog in the evening, but since he started high school, he's been coming home later and later. And as he's doing a lot of activities, I decided to take Kuro's walks upon myself. I didn't mind the route, it wasn't that long. I work and I go home pretty much the same time every shift, so I have time to vary the course for the dog for now and then. I take the dog on one of 4 routes so he doesn't get bored, or maybe so that I don't. Either way, it's what we do. The night that this experience took place, I took the dog on what I like to call the shrine route. From my home to the shrine, it's about a 15-minute walk. There's a baseball field nearby, and at night it's a pretty good place to let the dog stretch his legs. Now, as for the shrine, there used to be this big, beautiful Shinto shrine here, but it was destroyed in a suspicious fire. Rumor has it that it was arson, and a smaller shrine was constructed by local volunteers in its place. I was walking along the outskirts of the baseball field when suddenly a car came speeding out of an alley. Its headlights were on. It wasn't dangerous. It was nowhere near me, but it made me notice something because its headlight shone on an object ahead. It was inside the baseball field. The object was a 1-liter plastic bottle. Thought it was a bit weird. It looked black, and almost like the liquid was swirling. I guess it could have been some sort of cat repellent, so I held Kuro's lead tightly. He then began growling and pulling me away, so I decided to get out of there. After that, Kuro's behavior seemed to change. He's usually a very even-tempered dog, but that night, he felt like he was constantly sniffing for something. We kept going, and got to another corner. Kuro seemed to point at something with his body. I looked ahead and saw another one of those weird bottles with paper in its mouth. This time it was hanging from a hedge outside of someone's home. I wanted to approach it to have a look, but Kuro kept pulling me away. The liquid in the bottle was clear. The paper had been folded many times and was almost as long as the bottle. This is the part that really weirded me out. There was some sort of organic matter in there, like an internal organ. It wasn't all that big, but I could see it, slowly rotating. I really wish I hadn't. It was rather disturbing. I wondered if it was some kind of prank by kids, or some twisted individual had taken the organs of a fish or a frog and displayed them in this ritualistic manner. It was time for me to leave the area. I wanted to get to the shrine to finish off my walk, and I walked quickly, and Kuro didn't seem to mind. I felt the presence of someone behind the rows and rows of dori, the red gates you see at shrines, and I saw a shadow move. I heard the rustling footsteps of someone unseen. I perceived them to be coming from nearby. Amidst the red of the torii gates, I finally could see someone as they drew nearer. It was a middle-aged woman wearing Japanese-style clothes, carrying a heavy cloth bag ahead of her, which she was holding with both hands. I could see the spouts of 7 or 8 of these plastic bottles that I'd seen in the baseball field. As she got closer, she terrified me. Her face was bright white with layers and layers of makeup. She passed by me as if I simply wasn't there, and focused on whatever it was she was doing. She glared at Kuro, and my dog whimpered, and left us stunned and frightened. He vomited on the way home, and didn't eat that night. I thought about taking him to the vet, but it seemed that he was better by morning. Naturally, I stopped walking that route and reported what I saw. I don't think police were that interested in my story. Perhaps they thought I was just a bored housewife with an overactive imagination. I don't know what happened with those bottles, and if there are any more of them, or if they're still there. I asked about the shrine with colleagues and friends, and heard a few rumors. There were a further 2 reported outbreaks of fire. These reports were called in, and when the fire brigade arrived, nothing was reportedly burning. It's very weird, and I feel like something is going to happen around here. I just don't know what that will be.
I'm a hiker. I love the mountains. I found this thread, and it seems like a good place to share my experience. During the coldest period of the year, I climbed Mount Daisetsuzan in Hokkaido. It was freezing, one of the coldest winters I have ever experienced. Despite the winter temperature, that day the weather was gorgeous, even from the early morning, the perfect day for climbing. But it was winter, and the weather can change in the blink of an eye up in the mountains. During the afternoon, the clouds in the sky looked dark and worrisome, and in no time at all, an intense snowstorm had started up. It was a bit too late to turn back, and it would have been incredibly dangerous to do so. I knew that if I kept climbing, I would get to a cabin which was built as an emergency shelter. But I was worried that I wouldn't be able to find it due to the whiteout. I didn't even know my position on the mountain. I was prepared to camp out in a bivouac if necessary. You know, like a tent. I have a lot of experience in climbing, hiking and camping, and I came prepared that day. I was prepared, but to be honest, I wasn't looking forward to the prospect of camping in a snowstorm. Just as soon as these thoughts came to mind, the weather turned again. The snowstorm was showing signs of slowing. I could see my way again, and after a short while, I knew where I was. I didn't risk it. I headed straight to the emergency shelter. This took me about 2 hours. I was feeling very anxious and worried, but despite my anxiety, I found the cabin. It was almost entirely covered by snow. The sun was beginning to set. You know how early the sun can set in winter. I didn't want to be out there in the dark. I was so relieved to find the cabin, I have to say. When I went in, I noticed that there was 2 others in there. They were lying down, sleeping. I didn't want to wake them up, so I quietly closed the door. I laid out my sleeping bag and got in. I wanted to be warm. After warming up a little, I made a quick dinner with my provisions, and then I laid down to sleep. I woke up during the night. I don't know how long I slept for, hours, minutes. I was awakened by some mumbling sound. I guessed that it was the voices of those hikers who were in the cabin with me. I listened carefully, and it sounded like there was a man and a woman speaking. It sounded like they were talking about the trip they were planning tomorrow and the weather. I could hear some muffled laughter at points. I was thinking, why not just save this chat for the morning? Include me too. If we're going the same way, then let's help each other out. While I was thinking about all of that, I fell back into a deep sleep. I woke up the following morning. The atmosphere felt heavy. After a moment or two of being awake, about 10 men came rushing into the cabin. It scared the hell out of me. It was as cold as ice in that cabin. One of the men said to me, "Oh God, are you still alive?" I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I had just woken up and I was confused. Then another one of the men said, "No, it's them over there." He gestured with his chin in the direction of the man and the woman I was sharing the cabin with. I asked what was going on, and I was told that the 2 with me had radioed for rescue, but unfortunately, due to the terrible snowstorm, the rescue helicopter couldn't get up to them. The only choice the rescuers had was to go by foot, and it took 2 days to reach them on the mountain. Sadly, it was too late for the couple. They passed away due to exposure at a higher point in their climb. The rescue men were unable to bring the bodies down the mountain because the weather took another turn, so a decision was made to leave their bodies in the emergency shelter cabin rather than risk a double tragedy. These men were back to transport the bodies down the mountain. I couldn't get my head around it. I couldn't grasp the situation. What about the mumbling voices I heard? What about their conversation about how they were going to get down the mountain? Hallucinations and auditory hallucinations are not uncommon in the harshest of winters, apparently. Is that what this really was? I wasn't convinced. I asked if they were a couple because the way they had been speaking to one another sounded like they were. They confirmed that they were newlywed. This climb was part of their honeymoon. Furthermore, the male was apparently known to this mountain rescue team. He was a prolific climber. I was advised to leave the mountain range before the weather took another turn. I took that advice. I made it safely down the mountain, and I had a long time to think about the experience I had. I still think about it often. When I heard that I had spent the night with 2 fresh bodies, I was at first creeped out, especially since I had heard them talk to one another. I thought about the voices I heard. They were cheerful and not frightening. Like I said, they even laughed with one another at points. That kind of warms my heart. The mountains are wonderful places. I heard them say they were planning on leaving the mountain in the morning.
Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so very much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you who made it, or just watched the video, who made it to the end. Thank you so much. Your support means so much more than you could possibly imagine, and I am eternally grateful, so thank you. If you enjoyed tonight's video, don't forget you can check out more on the Mort's Bedtime Stories app. And I've got a little announcement. Finally, I am uploading tracks on Spotify, Apple Music, all the places. I currently have 1 album. It's done by albums. 21 tracks on Apple Music. So if you just tell Siri to listen to Mortis Media, I'm relatively sure I will play. So there you go. Obviously, I can't upload absolutely everything on these platforms. I'm going to upload some stuff, but if you want everything, it's going to be on here or on the app. But there is going to be a lot of stuff for you to listen to on there moving forward. It just takes a lot of time because you have to upload each track individually and put in information about each track individually, and it's just really long. So yeah, as you can imagine, uploading lots of tracks one at a time is not something I really want to do for hours and hours and hours on end. So yes, I think it's time to wrap it up though. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. You guys are seriously amazing. Thank you so much for everything. Hopefully see you in another video or soon somewhere else. Links on screen if you want more, but until then, stay awesome, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.